My guest today is Dr. Yara Haridy. Some of you probably know her from Twitter. She is an evolutionary paleontologist. She studies fossils. More specifically, she is a paleohistologist. Histology is the study of plant and animal tissue under a microscope. You look at a microscopic biological structure and try to understand macroscopic function from what's going on down there at the cellular level, the tissue level. Her focus lately has been on bone growth and bone remodeling. She studies this in fossil organisms. Remodeling is when bones repair and reshape themselves throughout an organism's life. Even once you're done growing, your bones do not just become dead rocks under your skin. They are living tissue, far more alive even than your hair or your fingernails. Your skeleton is spectacularly responsive to your lifestyle choices. Your bones are capable of constantly reshaping to meet your needs, and for some crazy reason, nobody seems to be talking about how amazing this is. Well, thank goodness you clicked on this video, because you are about to get over an hour, almost an hour and a half, of mind-blowing information about your skeleton. And you're going to get that information from the brilliant Dr. Yara Haridy. Yara, I'm extremely happy to have you on here today. You're going to give us kind of a little mini lesson on how it is that bone remodeling works. So behind me, I've got some skulls, and they're from different age periods of different animals. And so we can actually look at how remodeling works throughout an animal's lifetime. So I'm very excited to learn about this. But first, I just wanted to hear from you. How do you describe yourself?
First, thanks for having me on. I'm actually so excited. I'm always excited to talk about bones, but I'm extra excited to talk about remodeling because it's actually an aspect that nobody really asks me about. So in general, how would I describe myself? That's a really good question. I find it sometimes hard to fit into the paleontologist stencil, but I would mostly describe myself as a paleontologist and an evolutionary biologist. But I definitely haven't always been that way. I didn't have, the dinosaur stage that all kids have, or I was never interested in fossils growing up. I didn't even really know what it was. I didn't really know a whole lot of STEM things. My family didn't really do museums. It just wasn't part of growing up. So how did I get to paleontology? Basically, I was studying to go to medical school. I come from an immigrant background, and it's just, a good way to make your parents proud and show them that all their sacrifices were worth something. So I was studying to go to medical school, and I hated it. I hated it so much. One of the only places I could volunteer to gain more experience in anatomy was, ironically, a vertebrate paleontology lab. So I volunteered and fell in love with the topic and got my master's in vertebrate paleontology at the University of Toronto, and then moved on to getting my PhD, which is what I'm doing now in Berlin, at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And so how did I get to bones specifically? Basically, it was a very roundabout way, which had a nice stop at teeth. So I'm always interested in development and how things change over time. And the thing that made me really fall in love with paleontology was that you can ask these big questions. How did things change over the millions of years? The things that we have now, the things I'm learning in my medical textbooks, the things that we take as fact and always was, and the way we work and the way our skeletons work, the way our muscles work, all of it. You can ask insane long-term questions about why did it get this way and how did we get here and what things changed over time. And I applied that to teeth. And that's what my master's is about, the evolution of certain types of teeth. And now I'm applying it to bones because it's kind of the basis of paleontology, at least vertebrate paleontology. So that's how I got here.
What species teeth have you been looking at?
So for my master's, I started with these Permian reptiles that had very specific teeth that kind of look like little Hershey's kisses. And they're just sitting on top of the jaw. And nobody really knew how those teeth replaced because although like us mammals, we only lose our teeth once in our life, most animals continuously replace their teeth. Mm-hmm. So it's assumed that this animal also did that, but we didn't really know how that worked. So I looked at bearded dragons and agamids and like chameleons and stuff because they're known to be modern reptiles that don't replace their teeth. And I kind of did some comparisons and figured out that the Permian guy doesn't actually not replace his teeth. He does, but it's in a very cryptic way. And that's basically what my master's was on.
Oh, nice. So is it true that all mammals only shed teeth once?
Ooh, there are exceptions to every rule.
Yeah.
So the fun exceptions are manatees, dugongs, some kangaroo species. And then the opposite side of that scale is some types of shrews actually replace their baby teeth. Like the tooth starts to grow as a nub in the womb. And then when they come out, they're already like ready to have their adult teeth. So those are the exceptions that I know of. I'm sure there's more, but
so the manatee's doing it continuously?
yeah, they're kind of closer to elephants, where they have like these teeth at the back that kind of move forward continuously. Because elephants also do this. They have a set number. They don't have just forever continuously regenerating teeth, but they have a set number that slowly move forward as they wear away the front ones. And so there is technically like a conveyor belt, a really slow one, of teeth just going forward. Because if you don't have continuous teeth, you starve when you're eating tough stuff.
Right.
So.
And then rodents, I mean, their front teeth are continually growing. Do they actually lose them too at a point? Or do they just have one set that's always...
Oh, I don't know. I feel like they must lose their first set, but I really don't know. I actually don't know.
They are the weirdest, probably, well, as far as teeth go, the weirdest. Actually, I shouldn't say that because we've got things like narwhal. There's all sorts of weird teeth out there, but
yeah, mammals do some weird stuff with their teeth. That's for sure.
Yeah. I want to talk about bone remodeling, and before I do that, I just want to kind of show off my bone. None of these are real skulls. They're all replicas, but there's some things in here that have just really got me curious about how it is that skeletons are restructured throughout an organism's lifetime. I know that remodeling of bones is happening constantly. There was an interview with Chris Hadfield, who's the astronaut, the Canadian astronaut. He was saying that the first week that you're in space, you just pee out calcium because your bones are trying to remodel. They don't know what's happening in the zero gravity. That got me really curious. But then this skull right here, this is from a Peruvian. Her head was bound when she was a baby, and that's how her skull got elongated like this. It's funny because people on the internet say these are aliens, but obviously they're just humans with elongated skulls. The really fascinating thing about her is that her skull is not abnormally large. It looks abnormally large, but if you actually measure it, my nephew and I did a video where we measured this using Archimedes' principle, and we compared it to a normal human skull, and we found that hers is actually slightly smaller than the other skull that we had, but completely within normal human brain size range. She was just a small person. But yeah, for those watching, if you haven't seen the series Science versus the Aliens of Peru, I highly recommend it. It's pretty fun. We looked at all of the different internet claims that people have saying that these things are aliens, and then we compared them to the actual data. Here, I have a juvenile chimpanzee. The top of the skull is very round and smooth. And here, I have a mature chimpanzee, and he has this beautiful sagittal crest on the top. That's just, kind of like a bone mohawk.
Yeah, it totally is.
In the gorilla, that's just absolutely extreme. Huge crest up here. And in both of these animals, in chimps and gorillas, that does not exist when they're young. In fact, I've got this here is a baby gorilla, and his skull is shaped just like a human's, actually. So this one's a chimpanzee. I've got a gorilla over there. But this fact that bones are constantly changing shape is spectacular. Not all animals can do this. Is that correct?
Sort of. So not all animals can do a certain other type of remodeling. So we can get into it. There's different kinds of remodeling. One that most people think of, which actually causes most of the remodeling in our body, and it's called osteonal remodeling. And all that means is it's led by osteons. It's actually led by your blood vessels invading the bone and carrying cells with them that destroy and rebuild bone. We'll talk about that more in detail because that's the one that does a lot of heavy lifting in our skeleton. But the less known one, and that's what my publication was about, which is why I talk about it a little bit more often, is Perilacunar remodeling, so basically osteocytes, bone cells, live in these little caves. and they can remodel the cave that they live in. And the cave is obviously made of bone because they live in our bones and they monitor our bones, and they, check out if there's too much stress or not enough calcium. And if your bone needs remodeling, they're the ones that send out the alarm for these cells to come and do remodeling. But what they actually can do themselves is that they can take away calcium and phosphate from the walls and recirculate it back into the system. And this is happening on a cellular scale. It's super, super tiny. So all they're doing is just etching the outside of their environment and sending that. But when you consider that, aside from like neurons and other cell types, like osteocytes are the longest lived and very numerous cells in our skeleton, it does have an impact on your metabolism. So that's one type of remodeling. But the really interesting and the one that we can see very often is this osteonal remodeling, this type, which basically forms all these blood vessels coming through your bone, and they carry with them at the very front of them, they carry osteoclasts. So that's how they bury through the bone. They basically do these like mole tunnels through your bone, and then they send out osteoblasts on the outside and they rebuild. And that's how you end up remodeling old bones. So say you had an old wall, they tunnel through that old wall and then rebuild on their way out. And they do it in like a really interesting like zipper motion. So you're open it, like it's open on one side and they start to close it off as they go along. So
Wow.
yeah, and that's how we basically get a new skeleton every 7 to 10 years until you're like 25 or something along those lines. And it depends on the type of bone. And it's just continuously recycling, continuously renewing. One of your questions is, how do you get, crests on one animal and not the other, or over ontogeny as they're growing up? Why are they getting crests?
Yeah. So let's talk about the crest first, because it seems to be pressure from the muscles, the chewing muscles, that causes the crest to grow. Because they start out when they're young, they have the muscles just on the side of the head. And as they go through puberty, those muscles enlarge and they creep up. They get so big, they creep up the skull. And it seems like somehow by pulling on the skull, that triggers the cells to be like, oh, we need to build more bone here. And that process is just mysterious to me.
So only recently was there a paper that talks about how muscle and bone talk to each other on a molecular level, what hormones are sent across to have that communication. Because we know our muscles have an influence on our bone. That's why, if you work out, you get denser bones. If you go to space and you're not using your muscles against your bone as much, you get less dense bones. So we know that the two talk to each other. We just don't really know how. We don't know if it's something that's introduced by the muscle or something that's sent out by the bone. There are several ways that kind of goes on, but what you're looking at in that crest is a muscle attachment site. And it's known that muscle attachment sites will get more robust based on pressure. So kind of like you said, they're not exactly pushing up the bone and they're not exactly pulling at the bone. But what they're doing is, even if you have like the tiniest little crest and you have a little bit of muscle that's attached to it, as the muscle is working, flexing and loosening up and flexing and loosening up, it actually puts pressure on the periosteum there, the thin layer that covers all our bones and has the living cells in it. And that tells the bone, hey, this is an important spot, make it bigger, make it rougher so we can attach more things. So that's how you get some of those crazy crests on those primates, but it's also how you get really intense attachment sites on arms and legs and stuff in fossils. And that's how we reconstruct the musculature of extinct animals. We follow these rugose areas, these areas that are bumpy and lumpy. And that's how we know, okay, this is bumpy and lumpy because a muscle pulled on it a whole lot. So now we know that must connect to something here and that must connect to something here. So it's a good question because muscle attachment sites are incredibly important.
Yeah. If you were looking at a human skeleton, could you tell if the person was a weightlifter versus, regular Joe? Would that actually show up?
It would. It definitely would. Would I be able to tell? You probably want to talk to like anthropologists,
Yeah,
just because I'm not as familiar with human anatomy. But yes, you definitely can. There's even papers that they look at skeletons of like people from medieval times and look at the robustness of the femora, the leg bones, and how thick the cortical bone is. And they can tell, okay, this person was, working hard labor. And that, corresponds with the type of burial we found them in. And that kind of stuff does show up in your bones. Our skeletons record our lives.
I read a paper a long time ago, years ago. They found a broken bone that had healed on a human, and there was a certain structure in the face that made it look like for years they had this painful, wincing expression on their face that could actually show. It actually showed up in the bones. When someone is in pain, they move their face in a certain way, and that tugs on the bone a little bit, and they said they can actually read that in the face. I don't know how disputed that claim is, but they're like, oh yeah, this person was in misery their whole life. Isn't that awesome?
Oh God. I mean, that's ancient osteology for you. I kind of say the same thing a lot about animals. I'm like, oh, look at this pathology I found. It's so cool. This animal lived its whole life.
Yeah.
And then you realize you're like, not the nicest thing. But I don't know about that particular paper, especially because in the face, the human face, a lot of the muscles are so fine and they're smooth muscles. It's like they're not these like strong tugging muscles. I really wonder if they would make that kind of impact on osteology, but I wouldn't rule it out. I'd have to read the paper. But that sounds really cool.
So after my conversation with Yara, I looked this up. It turns out that I did not read about this in a paper. I watched it in a Nova documentary on PBS. And scientists do not agree. You can't actually tell someone's facial expressions, unfortunately, based on their skull. But in the Nova special, they did think you could, and they said this. They say, in the case of Kennewick Man, evidence for severe injuries suggested that the man lived many of his 40-plus years in frequent, if not chronic pain. He had a bunch of broken bones. He had indications that he got stabbed with a spear, all sorts of stuff. Prominent muscle markings above the chin and beneath the eye sockets confirmed this, revealing a face held in an expression of determined endurance. For this reason, our approximation shows the weariness of a middle-aged man in perpetual discomfort. That's a pretty cool sculpture. But their claim is contradicted by this paper, Facial Reconstruction, Anatomical Art or Artistic Anatomy, which goes over what we can and cannot trust in these facial reconstructions. These are really cool, by the way. It's pretty impressive what can be done, but you cannot get enough detail to figure out what type of facial expression a person was making during their life. So here we have this huge, on the top of the skull here, we've got this huge crest, so what you're saying is that it's the tissue on the outside of the bone that is getting that signal and is trying to grow in accommodation to that. That seems very different than what must be. Actually, maybe it's not that different than what's happening in an elongated skull. It seems to me that the brain, as the brain is growing, it is also somehow communicating with the skull case and telling it when it can stop growing, because, we have here, you can literally just bind a baby's head and it will grow long instead of round, which must mean that the bone is being instructed by pressure from the brain or by the internal organ.
The bone actually is probably being instructed by the pressure from the binding itself. It's hypothesized that human skulls ossify together later than other primates because our brains tend to grow larger proportionally to our skulls. So basically how our skulls fuse is that when you're born, skulls are made of all these little plates, and you probably see it in your casts. You have all these sutures, right? All the little zigzags where the bones eventually met. But those zigzags exist because those bones initially didn't meet. They actually had soft tissue in between. And that's why, babies have those soft spots at the top of their heads that people tell you not to press, but it's like really tempting. Anyway, don't do it. But we have several fontanelles. We have one at the top. We have one at the back. The one that everyone knows is the one at the top, but we actually have them at several spots, including the temples. And that is probably how you get that elongate shape. So because you're putting pressure on the frontal bones here and here, it can push out and kind of deform those soft areas because you're not working with plates that are attached to each other. You're working with floating plates. And then if that continues to stay bound, which I assume that culture, left them bound for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's 2 years. Yeah. Or maybe
So
even longer. Yeah.
I would assume probably longer, but at that point, the bone has no option but to ossify into the shape that it is kind of kept in. Mm-hmm. And the brain just kind of adapts to filling that space. And I'm not actually surprised that I would be super surprised if those people had any, brain deficits or anything like that.
Yeah. One of the things that is neat about these elongated skulls is they tend to have a really big, I forget the name of it. There's a hole in the back of some people's skulls, and these ones usually have a really big one for a blood vessel to get into. Parietal foramen. That's what they're called. Only some people have them, and these elongated skulls tend to have extra large parietal foramen. You were saying earlier that blood vessels can actually be summoned through bone and bore through bone. Can that happen at any time of life?
It has to happen at all points of life because that's how we actually remodel our skeleton. So think about it this way. Once your skeleton is laid down, once you have a bone that's laid down and it's like a concrete block, how are you actually going to take material out? And say you have micro cracks in this concrete block now, and you want to go in and fix these micro cracks. Yeah. Because eventually they might, each tiny crack connects to the next one, and then you have a problem. So you want to fix these before they become a problem. How do you do that? You actually have to, like you said, and I love this word, summon blood vessels through this hard material and have a way of basically recycling minerals inside. So that's what they do. You have a hard block and they have these vessels that burrow through these hard blocks and find where the micro cracks happened and take away all that damaged tissue and redeposit new tissue. And that's why usually you will never get, not never, but very unlikely that you get a break in the same spot because that area has been remodeled and it's kind of similar to, so if you know anything about planes, if a plane has a hole in it or a crack in it, what they actually do is they make more holes around that hole because it helps dissipate the pressure. And it helps whatever pressure is happening to actually move around it. So bones did that first. Basically, they have all these vessels around that area, and that area becomes stronger because it's been redeposited and rebuilt and fixed a bunch of times. It's more likely that the area beside it will crack or somewhere else will crack, but almost never the exact same spot.
That's interesting. More on the skull size that accommodates the brain. Have you seen or heard of these cases of hydrocephaly where the skull gets huge? Mm-hmm. Their skull will be maybe like twice the size of a normal skull because they're getting, they call it water in the brain. It's just you're making too much spinal fluid. That does suggest that the skull is growing based on pressure within it as opposed to some sort of pre-programmed size that the bone's going to grow.
So yes and no. Most of these kids, unless they're, usually people try to keep them alive and then, eventually the skull ossifies. Bone will try to meet bone. That condition starts basically from birth or within a couple of months. And it starts to separate because, again, those bones were never fused. So they separate, and then eventually the bone tries to grow together. That isn't to say there is supposed to be a predetermined size. There kind of is a predetermined size, but it's based on several factors. It's based on partially your brain, partially a timing of ossification. Maybe even if you had a normal sized head, but you delayed ossification in the skull, maybe your brain would grow bigger. I don't think so. There's probably research into this. But I think it's multiple factors that then kind of give us the average human brain size or average human skull size.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I was talking to the Bone Clones guys about, because they actually have one of the specimens is one of these. He was an adult. He died in his 30s, which is super rare. Usually you either have to treat it right away or you'll
Yeah,
die. And this guy somehow lived to his 30s. But they said that when they got the skull, it was almost paper thin in some spots.
of course. Yeah.
And so they had to be, it was really hard for them to make a cast of it because you have to put it in this plastery, rubbery stuff.
And they don't want to crush it, of course.
Right. So it was, that is interesting. So the skull, I mean, it is insanely huge. It's unbelievable. This is a human, but it's like he was saying, it actually did cause problems for the skull. It's not a nice thick skull like you would hope, and that's one of the reasons why these people have such a difficult time surviving the condition, because they could get a brain bruise, I guess, really easily.
I mean, I assume there's a lot more problems than just having a thin skull. I mean, having that much pressure on your brain cannot be good. I think now it's early. The early treatment for it now is just a shunt to kind of take out as much of the fluid as possible. I don't know what the more permanent treatment is, but I mean, I'm a big fan. Sounds horrible, but I'm super interested in pathologies for this exact reason, right? They help us understand what is normal, or why we actually get the normal physiology. Because if all you have is normal skulls, you don't get these questions, right? You don't get why does bone do this, or why does bone do that? So like, for example, one of the really interesting things is bone breaks, because they're quite common. You know, almost everybody's broken a bone. And that also has to do with remodeling. So when your bone breaks, the two ends at some point are either not meeting. Let's say it's a full break rather than a fracture. And then your bone has to try to kind of overcome that gap without shortening your limb, because short limbs are not really great especially for us bipedals. It's not the way to go. So, you know, your bone instantly freaks out and sends a bunch of swelling to kind of hold the ends apart. And then it pushes out cartilage to kind of make a stencil of a callus. And then after that, it will cover that in bone. All of that just to stabilize the outside before it can start to rebuild internally. It's kind of like making, what is it called? When people put up
Scaffolding.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's like when people put up scaffolding just to like paint the building, just to like actually get the person up to the point that it needs to be. It's like they're doing the same thing for cells and blood vessels. They're just like stabilizing the two. And actually, I have a broken bone here if you want to see it. Yeah.
I snapped my arm. I don't think mine would have healed at all. I snapped it way too good. But
ouch.
What
were you doing?
Skateboarding when I was like 15. I was in a half pipe, and my hand was on my elbow, so it completely folded. And when it folded back, it was kinked like this. So I had an S-shaped arm. I don't think that my biology could have fixed that without intervention.
No, probably not. No, probably not. Especially because our forearms are actually the most complex in the way where, you know, if we have our arm like this or like supinated, then, you know, our bones are normal and straight. But if you turn it, then our bones crisscross. So you have to like not only have them stretched out apart, but you need to like be completely immobile so you don't have the wrong bone ends fusing to each other, or having all four ends fused in one big knot, which is no fun for anybody. So what I'm going to show you here is a fossil. It is a cave bear, so not super, super old, but it's only like, actually I don't remember, but it's a European cave bear, and he didn't have a good time. So if you can see that.
Oh, wow.
So basically, here's the one end of the femur.
Wow.
And here's the other end. And what happened was probably something similar to what you described, which is, the bone snapped. And then, as you can see, there's a shortening, right? So this area slid down. And basically, the union is incomplete. And it tried to form a callus. It tried to kind of get around it. But to re-elongate that bone would basically be impossible.
Right.
So this was a juvenile animal, we can tell, because of the way that the top of the femur looks. It hadn't fully ossified at the top. So it's a juvenile animal that had a bad time. It tried to heal for a while. So you can tell that, it survived long enough to at least heal this much. But maybe, the short limb eventually didn't help, or maybe the winter was too harsh or something. But I always find pathology super interesting because they tell you about the animals, they tell you about the people, they tell you about normal biology. It's just, there's so many stories in just one specimen.
Yeah, that is really neat. That is brutal. That poor guy.
Oh, ouch.
When we're studying paleontology, how much can an animal's activity during its life change its skeleton? I mean, is it possible for us to think that we're looking at two different species when actually we're just looking at the same species that lived in very different conditions? So it changed throughout its lifetime.
That's a really good question. It's almost like a nature versus nurture situation, right? So I think of it kind of like we have a set stencil, we have a set structure, we have a set plan. There is a certain amount of wiggle room in certain directions, but it's not so crazy that you really, if you know the biology of the animal well, it's quite hard to really think that one species is different from another. That being said, with paleontology, a lot of the times we don't know the biology that well, right? Sometimes we only have one specimen of this one animal, and 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, we find another specimen that looks similar but not quite. And it's difficult. It's very difficult to realize, where do you set the line? How much difference equals a different species versus not? And in reality, in some ways, we're probably overestimating species because we don't know ontogeny. We don't know their growth series very well. And in other ways, we're probably underestimating diversity of species, because if you look at like modern anoles and lizards, a lot of them are completely different species. Their outside is different, their behavior is different, they live in different niches. Especially, I like the example of anoles because in one tree, you have the branch anoles, you have the ones that live near the trunk, you have the ones that live at the canopy, and they're making all these different niches across one tree. They all look different, they all behave differently, but their skulls are so similar. So similar. And that's
but they're different species. Like, we know they're different species.
We know they're different species because we have genetics and we have the external looks and the behavior and all these other factors that you don't get with fossils.
Yeah, right.
And also, when you look at their skeletons, they're very similar, but we also have a full skeleton for them. Now, cut that skeleton into maybe less than 20% of it, put it in a rock tumbler, and tell me if you can still figure out if it's a different species or not.
Right.
That's the challenge that paleontologists have.
Right.
So.
That's good. I used to volunteer at a wildlife rehabilitation center. And so we would deal with, injured birds of all kind, injured mammals, pretty much anything. We weren't allowed to work with wolves or deer or possums, because possums were considered nuisance, and coyotes were considered nuisance, and then wolves and deer were just too big for us. But we dealt with pretty much everything else in the state of Oregon. We had an osprey come in that didn't make it, and the guy that I was working with, the guy who runs the place, he was showing me it had a broken humerus. This is the humerus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, had a broken humerus, so the upper arm bone, and he was showing me that it's got these little. It's a very hollow bone, but it has these. They look like bicycle spikes. Yeah, these struts that go across. He was telling me that those form according to how that individual happens to hit the water when it's hunting. So those spokes will change over time. He says that every time he looks at one, it's slightly different. And he thinks that it's remodeling. I don't know if that sounds like a legitimate hypothesis to you.
I mean, it does. It does in a way where I would not be surprised, especially early on in the animal's life. So bird bones in general are quite hollow. Pterosaurs are the same way, and they have struts to kind of prop up the inside of the bone and distribute the pressure without adding extra weight. because, one way to make your bones strong is just to make them thick. But if you really want to get airbound, you're not going to want to add all that weight. So the way they do it is they add all these struts. Now, it's interesting because there is a couple of studies that show, okay, like here's an ulna of a vulture, and we know the way vultures hold their wings because, they kind of soar and they do it one way, and there isn't a whole lot of external differences in pressure. And so they scanned these bones and they saw that, the struts are, placed in areas of high pressure because we can actually test possibly where pressure is based on the bone shape. So I don't think that's a crazy hypothesis. I wonder how much of it does change because as you're remodeling something, you're taking stuff away and you're adding. So you have to do it at a rate that isn't weakening the bone, right? So the way we have osteoporosis is that the remodeling is happening so fast that you're doing a lot of the taking away without doing a lot of the adding. So I would assume this would be a problem for diving birds where, the remodeling just has to be at a good enough pace.
I think he was saying, it's been a long time since I had this conversation with him, but I think he was saying that the juveniles have more than the adults. So it's like the juveniles have them all over the place randomly, and the adults have them only in specific positions according to how they've been hunting.
I would not be surprised. That would totally make sense to me. I mean, if the juveniles kind of went all out with making struts at the beginning, and then the biology of the bone kind of narrows it down and takes away the ones that are not useful. And that actually happens in us as well. So our femora, like the top of the femur where it hits or inserts into the hip, it has all these struts that are optimized for our type of walking. And it distributes the pressure well from, hitting into the hip and also back into the femur. So, so you don't snap off your femoral head, which is a really bad injury. So it's a good way to distribute it. So we have all these struts too, and they've shown that the struts in runners look different than the struts in your average Joe that just maybe walks to work. So we look different on the inside depending on what we're doing, and those definitely remodel over our lifetime. So
that's so neat. I don't think I'm alone in this. A lot of us have been sitting around more since COVID started. And now things are starting to open up. We're all getting out and doing things. Here, I'm in Quebec, I'm in Canada. And for a while, we weren't even supposed to go outside except for within certain hours of the day. And then I have dogs, and there was an exception for anyone with dogs. You can be with your dog taking on a walk. It was that sort of extreme lockdown only happened for a little bit, and then people realized that's kind of crazy. People need to go outside and get fresh air. But honestly, I stopped going outside nearly as much as I used to. I just kind of got into this lazy habit, and now I'm going out and doing stuff. Do I need to be careful when I'm running around? Like, could I now break a bone easier than before? Does atrophy happen that quickly?
Atrophy can happen that quickly, but you're a young guy and you probably don't have to worry about it to that point. If it was like an 80-year-old woman who's been like, I'm going to go and start jogging tomorrow, like I'd be like, and chill out, grandma, like just take it slow at the beginning and, and give your bones a chance to catch up. I think you don't really actually have anything to worry about. But that is a good point because, I mean, myself included, I've been sitting a whole lot more. I've been inside the whole time. While I'm in Germany right now, or before at the beginning of the lockdown, we had pretty much the same thing, but they gave us an hour of outside time. Not actually enforceable, obviously, but they basically said the same thing. Everyone's allowed an hour, but you have to be masked and you have to be this and you have to be that. And in the end, I fell into a rut where I didn't move much either. So being inside long periods of time and not doing much and being quite sedentary has actually two dangers. And it impacts your bones in two ways. First, you're actually not getting enough vitamin D because you're inside, which is horrible for your mood. It causes it's been linked to depression and all that kind of stuff, but it's also been super linked to your bone not knowing how to metabolize your calcium. So say you're getting enough calcium, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't have the metabolically active version of vitamin D, which means any calcium you're taking in, you are peeing right out, and good luck.
Yeah.
Like it won't actually help you. So that's the first and horrible, impact to our bones from staying inside. Then the second thing is that, your muscles are not acting on your bones. They're not giving you that pressure. They're not telling your bones, hey, I'm being used. Please keep remodeling this area as you were. And our skeleton is always trying to optimize itself. It takes away from areas that aren't being used and adds to areas that are being used. So if you're not using your legs all the time, or your arms, or you're not exercising, it's not great for your skeleton. Your skeleton's like, oh, okay, I heard you really don't need this stuff. Let's lighten the load. And that's not what we want.
Now, the skeleton sort of acts like an intelligent system, right? It's finding ways to optimize itself. This all, do we understand? I guess we don't understand all of the rules that are happening, but this must just be happening as individual cells are communicating with each other and just obeying fairly simple rules, like if-then statements, essentially, if you want to think about it, like programming.
Totally. Yeah.
How many mysteries are there, do you think, that we still just don't understand? Or has that communication system been well understood? Like, do we know the if-then statements?
To a pretty big extent, yes, in some ways, because we have a lot of drugs that act on these if-then statements. Basically, like if hormone rankle is present, osteoblast is deactivated. If osteoblast is deactivated, it turns off its system. It's basically like coding. It's exactly like biological coding, right? So when one cell turns off its system, it changes its keys, and it can no longer be activated. It can only be activated when you turn on a different key. And that kind of stuff has actually been mapped out relatively well in humans. Because of the way we want drugs to act, we want to understand how our kidneys function. Our bones and our skeletons actually super intertwined with our kidneys, our liver, our adrenal system. And recently there was a paper that came out, I think it was last year, that showed that the skeleton is involved in your fight or flight response, which I thought was super cool. Yeah. So because our skeleton is tied in with how our kidneys work, and other hormones are actually produced in the skeleton, apparently one of those is responsible for your flight response, which I thought was super cool.
Yeah. Wow.
So there's a lot of stuff that's still to be discovered, like this, which was just discovered last year, was just published last year. And then other things that are pretty well known, like our remodeling cycle is pretty well known. We know how to kind of try to slow it down so that people, will increase estrogen in older women, and that helps slow down the over remodeling. So that only happened because we actually understand that system quite well.
There is this problem that women after menopause have, which is that the weakening of the hips. Well, I don't know. Is it the whole skeleton, or is it just the hip area?
Skeleton? It's the whole skeleton. So
why is that unique to women, or seem to be unique to women?
Good question. So because our remodeling cycle is actually related to our estrogen cycle, when women go through menopause, they lose the certain amount of estrogen that they were already making. So that loss, basically, the estrogen was the off key for your osteoclast, the cells that eat bone.
Dissolve.
So they're basically. So the estrogen was one step in one of those multi-chain reactions that then turns off those bone-eating cells. So when you lose that off switch, your bone-eating cells are going basically too far. They're doing their job too well, and there's nothing to check them. So that's why women have that problem. Why we see most of those issues in the hips and in the back, like you mentioned, is because we're bipedal. That's where most of our pressure actually goes. That's where our basically center of gravity is. Mostly it's your lumbar vertebrae. It's as they get weaker, they kind of compress, and that's why older people get shorter. We
Right.
actually lose like bone mass, and they, get shorter and they get the hunchback and all that. That's from deformation of the vertebrae. So that's all because of those links. And it's all because our remodeling system is just going too much compared to the building system, which is just not going as fast because we're aging. So it's kind of a double whammy.
And are you saying that's fully treatable now, or is it partially treatable?
It's only partially treatable because, like everything, nothing is super easy. So even if there are some estrogen supplements and stuff like that. I'm not a doctor, by the way, anyone that is watching. Not a medical doctor, but I've studied this quite a bit. So one of the issues is, okay, for example, and not that doctors have suggested this, but for example, let's say we replace estrogen to formerly normal levels.
Yeah.
All the other parts of menopause are still active. So your body actually doesn't know what to do with all the extra estrogen. And that has been linked with increased levels of breast cancer and cervical cancer and uterine cancer. So it's kind of an interesting balancing act. And now it's much more treatable, where they encourage young women like myself to go and get a baseline bone scan so they can, kind of monitor you for the next 30 years.
So my grandma, I just watched her suffer through this. It was horrible because she had to have a hip replacement, and she ended up getting frustrated with the cast, and she cut it off herself, and it healed wrong. And the last 5 years of her life, she was just
in pain, in agony,
super pain. And
first of all, what about us?
It was just so frustrating because watching this amazing woman have to go through this. Her doctor was telling her that when it first started happening, is that she needed to do more exercise because that would fix it. But you're saying that this is a hormonal thing. Exercise probably should help a little bit, but there's going to be a limit to that, right?
Right. So exercise does help, and exercise does change our hormones.
Yeah.
So, which I mean, exercise helps with several things that are hormonal problems, and actually can cause other issues with hormonal problems, because our muscles help with regulating certain hormones. Our bones help with regulating certain hormones. So it definitely would have helped. But like you said, there's definitely a limit to certain things. But so is there for medication. There's a limit to that. So what they're trying to do is combine, the limit of the medication plus the limit of the exercise. Hopefully that will, keep it at bay enough that you have a comfortable enough life as you grow older.
Yeah. Actually, sorry. I actually think it was her knee, but they had a titanium knee put in. Yeah. But it was due to menopause degeneration. So that's interesting. How much has our understanding of remodeling changed interpretations of the fossil record? Has that had a huge impact on what we thought we knew?
I would say yes, absolutely. Basically, with the evidence that comes from histology. So histology is the study of tissues, and paleohistology is the study of extinct tissues. And that's what I do. I'm a paleohistologist. So the way that we look at these extinct tissues is we take the fossil and we, glue it on a slide, and we cut it off and we grind it really thin. And then we can see through it and actually see cell structures and bone structures, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So now, once that method became pretty commonly used in paleontology, we realized that all these extinct animals don't have the same amount of remodeling. And the amount of remodeling is related to the amount of metabolism. So this was kind of already known in modern animals, but it leaked into paleontology, and that's definitely changed quite a few things. For a long time, people thought T-Rex and sauropods, those long-necked dinosaurs and stegosaurs, and all those things were big, lumbering, just slow beasts. And now we know exactly cold-blooded. People thought the same thing about ichthyosaurs and all those marine reptiles, mosasaurs. Everyone thought, those must have been slow, just cold-blooded blah things. And the reason we know a lot of that is because we study the bones and we study the histology of it, the tissues, and we see that they're actually remodeling their bone closer to mammals and birds rather than modern reptiles and crocodiles and all those the slow lumbering beasts kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that completely, phase shifted our understanding to, Like these were, active animals that grew quickly, that, fit into their environment differently. It doesn't only just change the way that you think of the animal, but it also makes you think of their environment differently.
Yeah.
If this animal had to sustain such a high metabolism, how much did it actually eat? How many trees did it take to sustain a brachiosaurus, really?
Right.
Because they're different when you look
Yeah.
at their bones. So yeah, it definitely changed our thoughts. And on top of that, I'll talk about one extra really cool thing. There's a very specific type of remodeling that's known to modern birds. And it's called, or it's a type of bone called medullary bone. It's bone that's in the center of a long bone. So think of your legs or your arm. We have a medullary cavity, a cavity where your red blood cells are made. It's just a hollow area, and that's normal. But in certain birds, during breeding season, when they're getting ready to lay eggs, before they lay eggs, they actually store a ton of calcium in there, and then they re-release it into their eggs. And that's how they make sure that they don't sacrifice their own skeleton while laying a ton of eggs.
Yeah.
And this is pretty well known in modern birds. They remodel the inside, they take it back out, and they put it in their eggs. And then, so you can actually tell, okay, that chicken, when I got that bone, it was an egg-laying chicken versus not. You can actually see it with like your naked eye. You don't need a microscope or anything. It's like pretty drastic change. Now, the cool thing is that we've seen that in dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So in like T-Rex and other theropods, we found medullary bone. So we know that they were investing physiologically a lot into these eggs and a lot into these kids or their offspring, because think of how big that animal is and how much calcium it's actually storing. And we're so lucky to catch it, in the act of storing calcium, but it tells us about their biology. It tells us possibly about their behavior. I mean, of course, it doesn't tell us if they had parental care or not, because we still don't know, but it's still pretty interesting, and it informs our ideas on these extinct animals a whole lot.
Yeah, that is really neat. Crazy things you can learn just from looking at bones.
I know, right? I'm trying to teach the gospel. That's what I'm saying.
Let's talk about how bone remodeling, the actual process, has changed over time. So you've done research specifically in when did these different types of bone cells emerge throughout evolutionary history. And you just published a big paper on that. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit here?
Sure, absolutely. This kind of comes from reading, the early textbooks of biology and just, learning, okay, A, B, and C, this is what happens. This is how bones do. The end. And then I was like, okay, cool. We know how bones do. And then I made the mistake of looking at fish. And it was a mistake because fish are incredibly complicated and they stem from way before tetrapods, right? So they come way down farther in the tree than we do. And so that doesn't mean they're more primitive. At least modern fish does not mean they're more primitive. It just means they took a different branch of life and they had a different tool set to work with. So everything looks really different in fish, and they just play by their own rules, which makes my life really complicated.
Yeah.
So I saw what modern fish were doing. I saw what, modern mammals, us, and reptiles, and I think everything that's alive today were doing. And I wanted to just trace it back and see when certain divergences happened. Yeah. So to understand why this is cool, I have to give you guys a little bit of Bone 101.
Yeah. So, one quick question first. What group of fish were you looking at?
Teleos, bony fish, basically the ones that make up the vast majority. So think tuna, think salmons, think opah, not sharks. So bony fish, the ones that would end up on your dinner table. Nothing extremely special, nothing extremely specialized. And they were still doing everything really differently than all the textbooks said, because apparently nobody looks at fish. So when you're looking for these rules that are supposed to guide all bone, and they have to apply to all animals that have bone. Otherwise, they're not rules, and therefore you have to dig deeper. And for me, digging deeper means digging deeper in time. So, Bone 101. So you got to know that basically there's 3 bone cell types that you just have to keep in mind. There's the bone building cells, osteoblasts, your bone destroying cells, your osteoclasts, and your osteocytes, which I call your bone maintaining cells, or the ones that kind of keep everyone in line. They orchestrate bone remodeling, they orchestrate a bunch of different things. They sense pressure in your bone. They kind of just, they live in the bone, and they have, think of squid arms or octopus arms, and they reach out everywhere. So there's a bunch of those, and they're the most numerous. So there's your 3 cell types. Now, all books say that those are your 3 cell types, one and done, that's it.
Right.
So it's pretty insane that the vast majority of living vertebrates today, the vast majority, don't have osteocytes. And all of
bony
those,
fish. Yeah.
all of those are bony fish, which
Crazy.
is just like, come on, you guys, like you cannot follow a single rule, like rude. So I looked back in time and realized they did have osteocytes at some point in the Cretaceous, and then lost it. And some things lost it even more recently. We're not 100% sure. There's a couple of new papers that are coming out about exactly when certain things were lost. Anyway, they come from ancestors that had osteocytes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We're back to following the rules. But if you go back just even a little bit farther, before jaws evolved, before limbs evolved, before any of that, so you're looking at mud slurping jawless fish, early Devonian, Silurian, the earliest vertebrates, armored jawless fish. And you look at them, the earliest ones, again, don't have osteocytes. And they don't have visible osteonal remodeling, the type of remodeling that we talked about earlier that's guided by your blood vessels. Okay. They don't have it. It doesn't exist. Okay. So now we know that all our bone and all the superpowers that our modern bone hasn't always existed, but they were acquired through evolution, and possibly in a stepwise fashion, possibly all at once with one animal. We're still not 100% sure. When you look a little bit later, there's another jawless fish that has osteocytes and has a bunch of other features that makes us think, okay, those are the ancestors to jawed vertebrates. And then from those, the earliest jawed vertebrates are the ones that have osteonal remodeling. And from there, you get, all your splits of cartilaginous fish and ray-finned fish and all the fish that we have today. And then sarcopterygians, the lobe-finned fish, the ones that lead eventually to us, tetrapods. The story of bone is basically the story of vertebrates. It starts right at the beginning with a really extremely simplified external armor. They look like beetles. They have only bone on the outside. They don't have any bone on the inside.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay.
They have no bone on the inside. It's a cartilaginous skeleton on the inside, bone on the outside only. And the bone on the outside is covered in, pause for effect, dentine.
Oh, wow.
Which is what our teeth are made of.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Yeah. So the first tissues that make our teeth today actually started out as ways that our mud slurping ancestors protected themselves.
Yeah.
So that's the story of bone. That's the story of teeth. They're all interconnected. And I got asked a really good question, which is why? Why did they need all this armor? Why did they need to put teeth on the outside and bone? Why did bone evolve in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. You get to that point where, okay, so not everything existed, not all the features existed. Why did the very first mud slurping fish even evolve bone? What was the point? Maybe they were happy to be soft, squirmy, wormy things. Why didn't we just continue down that road? And the answer is very likely because of eurypterids, these giant sea scorpions that tried to basically eat our early vertebrate ancestors. And they're like, this is not how we're doing this. I would rather be armored and survive. Thank you. And that's how vertebrate mineralization likely started, from that predation pressure. So we can thank scorpions and arachnids for our skeletons, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Nice. Okay, Editor Jon here. What Yara just said there is so important that I have to restate it. Not because she didn't state it well enough, but because it's so important. I want people to really understand this. It appears that our skeletons and our teeth, the molecular precursors, the genes that we now use to build our skeletons and our teeth, those evolved during an arms race with ancient marine arthropods. Or again, as Yara put it,
So we can thank scorpions and arachnids for our skeletons, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
so the first skeletons in vertebrates were exoskeletons as well.
Exactly.
That's really crazy.
Yes. Isn't it?
Sharks still have like teeth things on their teeth, like scales. Sharks do. Am I right?
You got it. You're right. But also sharks stem from a bony ancestor, and they just lost their bone secondarily. So they come from that first jawed ancestor, the one that had jaws, that had an exoskeleton, but also some internal mineralization. And sharks just secondarily lost it. And we think of sharks as being so primitive because they're cartilaginous fish, but actually, much like modern fish that don't have osteocytes, that's a secondary feature. That's a derived feature for them. That happened later. They did keep the teeth on the outside, though, because they're cool like that.
Yeah. So we have the evolution of bone on the outside, and then somehow the genes that were involved in that ended up also distributing bone around the spinal cord and so on. Do we start to see modern looking-ish skeletons? Does it start at the spine or the brain case? Like what is the first thing that we see ossifying?
In us today, we have two types of bone called endochondral bone and dermal bone. So dermal bone is what makes up all your skulls. Like your skull bones are all dermal bone. And endochondral bone is your internal, from the word you can tell, endo, inside, chondral, cartilage, and then bone. So cartilage-based internal bone. And that's how our limbs and everything form. They form from, first they make cartilage, and then bone invades the cartilage and basically takes over that shape and ossifies that shape, more or less. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's endochondral bone. Dermal bone is from our early mud-slurping ancestors. That's what the exoskeleton was, and that's what eventually became our skull bones. So we still have dermal bone. Okay. We still have that stuff that they came up with from the beginning and figured it out. So the very first mineralization was, your brain case and your skull, because that's what they had. I mean, it was an exoskeleton, but it was also mostly their skull. And then after that, it was the vertebrae, which started with something called perichondral ossification, which all that means is, think of like an orange peel. So it's only an orange peel of bone that lives on the outside of a cartilaginous vertebrae. And so they had that. And then eventually they had fully ossified vertebrae and limb, like fins and all other kinds of fun ossifications that led us to the weird skeletons we have today.
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so I have a wiener dog, and her kind is really prone. They've got a mutation that's someone liked because it made them look longer, but it can also cause the cartilage plates between the backbones to ossify. They partially ossify and they become super brittle, and then they break and squirt liquid out, and it causes major pain for the animal. So a lot of them have to be put down when they're young. It's absolutely horrible that this happens. But what I find interesting about this is that a relatively small mutation, in this case, it's actually a gene duplication. It can cause something that evolved to exist in one part of the skeleton or one part of the body to get superimposed on a totally different part of the body. And you have this transfer of traits from one place to another just because of a or in this case, a gene duplication. That's so interesting to me, because you've got this, what used to be an exoskeleton and is now internalized, that could have happened with actually probably a fairly simple mutation, could have caused a switch like that. But if it was a big change at once, it probably would have been weird early on. So, but you're saying that the skull is essentially an exoskeleton, but of course we have skin on the outside of our skulls. Was there a switch that had to happen there, or did these early exoskeletons actually have a thin layer of skin on the outside too, do we think?
So we do think that they likely had some soft tissue on the outside, and the only reason we think that is because they have sensory pores and sensory canals that are part of that exoskeleton. I mean, it's not really an exoskeleton; it's just a giant skull and a fish body attached to it. But they look like beetles. They look crazy. And they do have sensory pores. You know, they had like we think it's probably either to sense differences in pressure in the water or differences in like ion gradients or maybe any of those. We really don't know. But somehow those would have had to be protected. You really because they lived. They were like bottom dwellers. You know, they were flat on the bottom and had like a dome top, kind of almost like a flatfish or a stargazer that we know today. They lived in these shallow seas and they kind of that. So you don't really want sand rubbing up against your, you know, sensitive pores or whatever.
Right.
So very likely they had soft tissue. Also, we see that when they are attacked, that they're healing these exoskeletons, these dermal bones. So to heal dermal bone, you have to have some amount of cells actually reaching the wound site. So very likely they had some kind of soft tissue that covered it.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that the skull started to ossify before even the backbone did.
Yep.
That's really cool.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? We're cranates. I mean, we come from animals that, you know, when it comes to divisions of Animalia, like we came from things that formed a very distinct head, and we clearly care about our head and its, you know, our control panel. We don't really have a decentralized nervous system like some animals do, you know. We have a very centralized nervous system. So you want to protect that. And it's very likely that actually started with some of these early jawless fish, because we have like basically almost like an endocast of what their brain would have looked like, because this exoskeleton or this dermal bone wrapped around what would have been their nerves and brain and all that so tightly that we can actually figure out what shape it was. So we knew that they actually did have a brain-like system, and we can actually trace nerve canals and stuff. It's quite detailed, and they preserve really beautifully.
I've been really interested in how dental occlusion ends up forming. So the way that teeth match each other, kind of like puzzle pieces inside the mouth of an animal. And we see this happening in sort of like a kind of a, maybe you would say, a primitive way, even in crocodiles. So their teeth kind of go past each other, and they seem to be pushing each other around, actually. They're growing down from the top and up from the bottom, and when they connect to each other, they push each other outwards. And there's a time lapse floating around on the internet of braces. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's just, you start out with crazy teeth, and the braces just pull everything, and it's amazing how fluid bone is. It's spectacular. Here I have, this is a blown up version of a vampire bat.
Yeah, they're crazy. Their incisors are insane. Yeah,
these incisors are crazy, and there's a little pocket of that captures those incisors in the bottom jaw. So it's like pressure from those teeth caused the bone to move out of the way. It really looks like that's what happened, because it fits like a sheath. They got a really tough soft tissue covering there as well, but it looks like as the animal's growing, it's just constant pressure on that bone caused the bone to move out of the way. How much of that, am I right in thinking this? Is it just
absolutely.
pressure? Yeah.
So I mean, I don't think it's 100% pressure. I think there's definitely some sort of genetic precursor that just tells like bone to not grow as much there, and then secondarily reacts to pressure being there or presence being there or a certain amount of tissue being there. That's definitely true. And we can see it like happening in real time, like you said, with braces. And that happens for several reasons. So all the teeth that you showed me today, are not attached to bone. They're actually attached to a ligament that's then attached to bone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of like press down on your teeth a little bit, you kind of feel them like springing. There's a bit of give. And that's because we have something called a periodontal ligament, which is just your mouth ligament, and it holds the teeth into its bony socket. And that is where the interaction happens between the ligament and the bone. And so slowly but surely, what braces do is that, the wire will pull the tooth this way. So you're constantly pushing a tooth against a ligament this way and pulling this way. So the ligament is, for example, pulling on the bone in one direction and therefore causing the bone to grow in that direction more and resorb from the other side. So the pressure is definitely truly remodeling the inside of your mouth, which is what braces do. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And likewise, the lack of pressure also causes remodeling. So this is why if you lose your teeth, so like people who are completely edentulous, completely lost all their teeth, doctors will still recommend that you get dentures, even if you don't want to. They recommend you wear dentures as much as possible because that pressure is really important to keep your mandibles the right shape. If you ever look at an old person's, like from medieval times or before all this, you look at their skulls, you can tell it's an old person. Their mandibles are much thinner. It literally looks like they're curling in on each other because the bone doesn't have that pressure anymore. And I assume the same thing would happen with like dogs that have those grooves, for their upper canines, they have those grooves. It's probably the same thing with the vampire bat. I would assume it's probably the same thing. If they somehow lost their incisors, I bet you if they lived long enough without an incisor, they would probably refill those bones. Those like holes. So like I have all 4 of my wisdom teeth removed. I had a scan done recently because I thought I had a cavity. And I saw that the area that my wisdom teeth were removed is no longer it's not a hole. It's just bone has gone in, filled that up because there's no pressure there to maintain that alveolus or the bone or the hole that the teeth were in. So the lack of pressure causes bones to sometimes fill in. And sometimes lack of pressure causes over-resorption. It just depends where in the skeleton it's happening. So you're totally right.
Yeah, so this is the Peruvian skull. She was probably in her 60s is what they think. She's missing a bunch of molars and her wisdom teeth have moved forward to just with all that space. They've just moved around a lot. It's really interesting to see. I mean, I envy you because, you were working. Are you still working in a museum?
Yeah.
Yeah. You get to look at this stuff and just think about it all the time, every day. That's why I've collected these skulls over the years. It's just, there's so many weird things you just pick up on if you're surrounded by these things.
And if you actually look, I mean, there's plenty of people that, will hold something, oh yeah, that's cool. And then like move on. But then you're staring at these little features and you're asking these important questions. And that's why I definitely encourage people to, like if you find a skull in the forest, like keep it, stare at that thing. It's weird. Ask questions. It's important. But yeah, I mean, that's why I love working at a museum. Whenever I feel not inspired, I just go into collections and I find 10 more projects. So
it was really neat working at the wildlife center because I would, we would have injured animals. Like, everyone's like, oh my gosh, you're such a good person, you care about these animals. But I was really just curious about their anatomy, and I could get close to them without them running away because they were injured. So it was kind of I had a different reason for being there than other people. I was just fascinated in these things. But one of the really weird things was we'd have birds that would come in, they'd have a broken humerus and would rip out of the tissue. If it was dried, if the bone tips were dry, they were screwed. Yeah. You would have to cut off until it's wet again and then put that together. And if one wing is shorter than the other,
it's useless. Yeah.
Sometimes we would hunt them, and we had a big hunting yard where we could see if they could still hunt and catch prey and stuff before we let them go. Sometimes they would relearn that, I have to fly harder with this wing because it's shorter. Sometimes they would not. So we would go through this whole process of reviving them, going through surgery, and then we just euthanize them anyways. It was horrible. But it's amazing what an animal can recover from. And that bone is really working hard trying to fix itself. Even in a bird, you'd think that a bird wouldn't be able to survive a broken wing ever, but they do. They heal.
With human help, for sure. I mean, bone will keep healing as long as it's being, as long as, like you said, the two pieces are vital. So they still have circulation and they still have the periosteum. What they're asking for when they're saying it's dry means the periosteum has peeled off and all the vessels are gone, and it's basically dead bone. So putting that back in is like necrotic tissue, and it's not a good time. Yeah. So bone will keep doing what bone does and try to fix itself as long as the animal is still getting enough nutrients. The question is it going to be able to function? Right. And that's always difficult to tell without giving the animal a shot, right? Like it's hard. It must be such a hard call to make.
Yeah. I mean, after they've been doing it for a few years, there's always someone who knows that one's going to make it, that one's not. Well, they doesn't know, but is certain enough that we're not going to spend all of our resources on an animal that's not going to end up making it. But yeah, it was a really neat project. And I also got to work with, we had a beetle box. So we would take, if it was a specimen that was really interesting, we'd take it and put it in that had died. We would put it in the beetle box, and then we'd use the skeleton for educational stuff. And birds are the most fascinating thing. And just when I was preparing a body, you'd remove the feathers, and just to see how the whole feather structure works. It's so intricately entwined with even with the skeletal system, the flight feathers are. It's really neat to see that.
They attach right into the ulna. It's pretty crazy. Those what is it called? Shoot. Whatever. Yeah, those like bumps that they have on the ulna that show that there were flight feathers. I mean, we have that in fossils too. That's how we know that some of the early I forget which ones, but basically those ostrich mimics, those ones have all kinds of, we know that they probably had big feathers. Whether they were actually functional as anything is not the point, but they definitely have them because we have the osteological correlation. But yeah, I mean, working with bones and working with, even though it seems morbid to most people, but I think we know better. But working with the bodies of these animals that you've read about as a kid, or you've seen in documentaries, or you've seen outside, but never got to be that close up to it, and seeing how all these pieces actually fit together, and like you said, the feathers laying on top of each other so perfectly. And knowing that they molt them every year and they're still so perfect, it's just crazy. And that's the coolest part about biology, right?
Yeah, we are vertebrates are just the most amazing things.
I think you're just going to make a lot of invert people really upset.
Well, of course, a vertebrate would think that vertebrates are cool, right?
There is a vertebrate bias. I mean, yeah.
Well, do you have any, are there any just burning things that you think the world has to know about skeletons?
Let me think.
That we haven't covered yet?
I guess I want everyone to know that that our skeletons are absolutely amazing because they are living lattices. They are living structures. And while we're not the first to invent skeletons, I mean, sponges have skeletons, crabs technically have skeletons, exoskeletons. We're not the first to invent mineralizing something to support our bodies or to support our muscles. As vertebrates, we are not, but we are definitely the first to invent a living structure that adapts to what we do in real time in our lives, because snails have a skeleton and sponges have a skeleton, but they can't remodel it. Once it's made, it's dead. But ours listens to us and changes with our needs, which I think is what makes our skeletons really unique. And I think that's why you picked up on remodeling as your main topic, because it's such an interesting topic. It is what makes it special.
Yeah, I think we have this false idea that a skeleton is just like a dead rock inside of us, right? A bone is, but it just. I mean, you were saying that your bones rebuild themselves until you're
Every
an
like
adult.
7, yeah, no, well, even after, you basically get a fresh new skeleton every 7 to 10 years, because of, the calculation goes like, I think you remodel like however many grams of bone each day, and then they just scaled it up to time and to how much in your skeleton. And so our skeletons are working really hard for us to make sure that, you don't have the same bone that you were born with, because it has all the micro cracks. Every step you've ever taken, everything you've ever lifted creates strain in your skeleton and creates all these micro cracks, and it wants you to have fresh new bones to work with every few years. So certain areas of our body remodel faster than others depending on the strains, and probably the best thing you can do for your skeleton is eat right, see some sun, and just take a walk every now and again. It'll serve you well.
That's cool. Well, Yara, thank you for coming on. This was amazing. Seriously, this was better
Is
than
it
I thought
everything you
it'd
wanted?
be. It's
Yes.
better than I thought it'd be. Yeah.
Yes.
I guess my message for people on bones would be to a lot of people tell kids not to look at the dead body on the dead cat on the side of the road and stuff like that. If the kid's interested, let them look.
Yeah, make them poke it.
Yeah, let them poke it. Yeah, maybe use a stick if it's really rotten.
Fine.
But
if it's a little squishy, makes sense. But yeah, I mean, encourage curiosity into osteology, and I mean, all natural things has definitely always been my message. I'm glad you agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was really fun, and I love talking bones.
And that is it, my friends. Yara Haridy. I do recommend that you follow her on Twitter. If you're on Twitter. I don't know if she has Facebook and all that other stuff too, but her Twitter's pretty good. She's always posting cool stuff on there, so check that out.